Black Cats Run podcast.
I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll. This is Black Cats Run. Today's episode, we're back. It's not working. What do I do? Let's get into today's episode. What do we do when it seems like what we are attempting to do, the process, method, strategy, depending on what scale you're making that intervention that we call training, what do we do when that's not working? How do we respond to that? I think this feeling that it's not working, the feeling that we're stuck, that what we should be seeing or getting out of the process that we're applying, that it seems like there's something that doesn't line up. How do we respond to that? How do we do things differently? Do we need to do things differently? I think a great way to think about this concept of it's not working is to think about what are we being reactive to? How do we reach the conclusion in the first place that it's not working? So one factor here is the factor of immediacy. Okay, where when we are looking to determine if our training is effective for whatever that is in the endurance sports domain, or really in any domain of athletic performance, and I suppose you could take that further and you could say in the domain of anything in which you're looking for a scale of improvement as a result of some approach to the problem, right? The essential problem being, I'm at A, I want to be at B. How do I move across that metaphorical space, right? And that improvement in movement across the space from A to B is what we would say constitutes an improved ability to perform or results in an improved level of performance. How do we know if we're getting there, right? So immediacy is an issue. A lot of times when we start doing something, we kind of have this one-to-one mindset, right? That we put something in and then something should come out in kind or proportion. But the scale of investment is not proportional to the scale of return. I don't think that finance is the ultimate metaphor for exercise, physiology, or these kinds of pursuits, but just as an exemplar, right? When you put money into any kind of investment vehicle, right? Let's say you're saving money for retirement, you've opened up a brokerage account, you've decided to put money in an index fund, whatever, right? You're investing money in that, right? The scale of return is not in kind of the scale of investment. So if you put $100 in, you don't then make $100, right? You might put $100 in, you might make $1, right? That would be a 1% return. If you're looking to invest money, right, if you can make 10 to 15%, maybe a little bit more over a longer and more meaningful period of time, that's a huge benefit, right? That's considered very successful, right? When people talk about retirement accounts, Long term, right, for those of you getting your career and you're doing that, right, you might be projected to have, well, maybe 6%, maybe 9% might be a more conservative, realistic estimate for most of us, right? And that would be sort of, per year, right? And anything over that is great. It's not that, I invested $10,000 this year and now I have $20,000 12 months later, right? And the scale of time is also very significant too. Now, the rules of this kind of investing process is not A, the domain of the podcast, but it is also not B, causal or related to some fundamental universal principle here, but just in a metaphorical sense. I think that we expect a significant level of return where if we again put in X, we expect to recoup X. So if I put in 8 times 400 and I run them in 60 seconds, then we say, okay, well, this must mean blank. And I've had all kinds of dialogue and conversation with people over the years of doing this stuff where there's this idea of a calculation, right? A subjective, in a sense, but nonetheless calculated expectation of if I put in this workout, right, that is a measured form of investment, right? And that should yield a in-kind measured version of return, right? So when it seems like it's not working, it may be the case that it isn't working. And I want to speak specifically to that. But one of the problems here is how are we reaching that conclusion in the first place, right? How do we attempt to measure that? Because we need to, if we really want to test the efficacy of any particular strategy or approach to anything, it needs to be something that we try over a long period of time. As a teacher in the classroom working with young people, this is also a very common phenomena where you introduce, hey, here's a strategy, here's an approach, here's a method. We want to try to engage this and we want to use this tool as a way to kind of work towards this different level of capacity or performance, ability, proficiency. And the frustration, right, the sense of this isn't working is oftentimes immediate. And in that context, one of the things that I think people want to see is they want to say, okay, well, the point of doing it this way is because it's supposed to make it easier to be better, right? And if we extend that concept of if we expect things to be easier and better, what does that mean in the sports context? So whereas with the financial concept, the idea of, well, you invest money and you make only a small percentage of that in return over a long period of time, in this sense, and we said, well, that's not really a direct like rule or law. But in the context of when we expect things to happen as outcomes from the things we attempt to learn in life and get better at, that I believe now we're at something that does have reciprocity across these different domains, because now we're getting at the concept of expectation. And to what extent and in what ways does expectation function as a dictate of perception of effectiveness? So when we do certain things, we bring to the table a kind of regarding attitude where we're saying, okay, I should be able to receive something in kind for this, right? And now we're bringing our expectations. So we're going to measure and make a determination about whether something is or isn't working in terms of whether or not we can see that in a manner that meets our expectation of what it should look like. All right. And I think this is a significant concept to think about. And I think we all do this, right? Which is kind of, I think one of the core issues here is there's some basic behavior or psychology in general about how do we approach the process or the thought process of considering, is something worth my time or not? And it seems like at baseline, we're looking for immediacy, right? Well, if this is working, then I should feel some tangible benefit, right? And especially we want, I think, something to be evident to our senses, right? It's a sort of Aristotelian level of logical thinking. I should be able to feel, see, perceive, right? This, right? Not something that I would maybe abstractly measure, but I should be able to genuinely perceive the difference. And in essence, an exercise, right? And, this aerobic endurance sports, what we're basically looking for is we want to say, okay, I can go at a higher level of work with a lesser level of exertion. We want it to be easier, right? And we want that to be as immediate as possible. And the most effective training for a lot of us is then the idea of, okay, I'm trying to find the training that makes things easier the most quickly. And this is what leads to the fascination with the idea of there being specific sorts of basically Byzantine type structures of special workouts and certain sequences and manipulating the rest and the intensity and over and under and increasing it and doing it sets in this way or that way or whatever. And it's because, right, we're constantly sort of massaging the ego around this idea of, well, there's just supposed to be something here that is going to make things easier. And that's received wisdom, okay? That's received wisdom is that we are consuming, right, a zeitgeist. We're consuming this ethos that is like pathologically endemic in the community spaces around these sports that you should do things and you should notice a difference very quickly. And the reality is that's not how that works. One of the ways we know that's not how that works would be to, say, do a specific training intervention, allow some moderate level of recovery and rejuvenation, but then go out and then let me do a regulated, controlled physiological marker of performance, right? And so if you go to say, okay, wow, I did this workout, I did 8 400s, or I did 8 times 90 seconds, or whatever your concept is, right? Some sort of interval workout focused on, really exceeding the maybe sort of more sustainable aerobic pace that you might usually apply in racing or continuous training efforts. Okay, right? That's something that we tend to think, this is going to give me more rapid and more meaningful and immediate results. However, what we see in practice is that if you go out and you then, test, repeat a lactate threshold step test, you're not going to see any change, right? So the physiology of efficiency, the physiology of capacity for performance isn't going to be varying on that scale. But people will tell you anecdotally, well, I did this and I'm already noticing a benefit. And I think people talk like this all the time because there's this kind of social fear of missing out on a common or shared experience where people want to feel that, well, what other people are saying they're having, I need to be a part of it, right? That there's something essential out there to the life experience or within whatever scale or space you're focused on. And people, I think, will just start parroting and regurgitating the claims of other people because they have no conception of what they're experiencing themselves is one possibility, right? They have no concept of what they're experiencing. So they don't even know, right, if the difference between feeling good or feeling bad, they're just like, oh, okay, I do this. I must be noticing these benefits because people are saying I'm noticing these benefits. So then they're suggestively basically reaching this reinterpretation or specific kind of presentation around what they are experiencing and what they expect to be getting out of that process. Another possibility is that we can see people, I think, have an incentive sometimes to just make claims, right, to do stuff, because if they say it's true, then they will be externally, right, socially perceived to be having the desired experience. And for a lot of people, this stuff ultimately comes down to the perceptions of others, right? How do other people see me and regard me, right? The value of doing these activities, putting my time and energy into them, is it creates or alters my sense of identity within the social space or the social environment that I'm engaging with. So just because people are claiming things are different doesn't mean that they are in fact different, but at the same time, this becomes the milieu in which we're inhabiting, and it essentially isolates our reasoning because so much of this stuff is ultimately going to still be driven anecdotally because the tools to measure performance are just not accessible at the level of effectiveness that we would need right? Like really what people need is you need a sports watch that can actually just tell you what step are you on that, lactate test and can evaluate that. I don't think we're even approaching the capacity to do that. I think that might be something that, in a sense is, I don't even know how you would conceptualize executing that in the first place, never mind having the ability to actually collect that data, right? But people might substitute for that and they might say, oh, my Garmin says my VO2 max is blank. It says it's gone up. Well, I think that A, your watch doesn't know what your VO2 max is. B, we've discussed on the podcast the limitations of VO2 max as a pilotable concept in order to assess fitness because of the limitations to its legitimacy as a metric for performance. And, there's a variety of other confounding factors to that we don't need to get into, but we also want to acknowledge that, for sports manufacturers, right, sports performance goods, right, their incentive is to engage the consumer with the idea that their product is worth consuming, right? And so if you have a sports watch that doesn't tell you you're improving, then I think people aren't going to like that product. So there's also, I think, a systemic design issue, a design bias behind this stuff, that there's going to be an idea, well, let's create something that's reactive and responsive so that people are getting that kind of immediacy because we know that's what the consumer values in the product. And you can rationalize that by saying, look, we're encouraging people to engage in these sports and we're making them more fun and we're increasing that level of reward. And, maybe the data isn't as objectively, scientifically valid as it would be in a lab, but ultimately the benefits of this, outweigh whatever the downsides is, blah, 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 right? You can just sort of continue to imagine and, spiel out the drivel of justification for that process. But I think on a fundamental level, measurable difference happens over a slow churn, right, of consistent exposure to training stimulus. And we have to be patient on that time scale. I think you probably have to wait, I'm going to say, probably 8 to 10 weeks minimum to notice any kind of a meaningful benefit from training that is going to manifest as something that's evident. So it's got to be on that time scale of 8 to 10 weeks before you can really even reach a determination of whether or not something is working. But that's very much in conflict with our idea of what is the scale of immediacy. So this psychological expectation that we should have an immediate, noticeable, discernible difference, the confirmation from other people around us claiming they're having that experience is going to encourage us to look to see that, right? And either we're going to convince ourselves that we're experiencing something because we have this cultural anxiety or cultural dread of, being the ugly duckling here and not experiencing what everybody else says. And I think this is also a endemic psychological issue that people will willfully and intentionally and deliberately perpetuate the idea that certain experiences are fundamental, accessible, and realizable. And it's a core behavioral problem in our culture that I think leads people chasing after, tilting at windmills like Don Quixote, where these things that we're striving for are just never going to be attainable because they're ephemeral, right? They're largely a social construct of illusion. And I think the way in which we use personal media to tell stories about what we're experiencing just sort of exacerbates this problem by creating this sense of tangibility and authenticity and legitimacy to those claims and narratives of experience, when I think the reality is they're just kind of a bunch of bullshit. So we have, right, this tension between what we were describing now as there's the scale on which you would expect to see a meaningful, significant change. Now, I also think, and I have evidence from my own experience, that when you make a substantive change that's effective, oftentimes you can start to see changes on a scale that's shorter than that, right? But I think you can't really reach a conclusion that something doesn't work until it's been 8 to 10 weeks, right? Because that's what we're talking about, the idea of it's not working. Now, it does seem to be the case that if things are working, you might be able to notice improvement in as few as 3 to 4 weeks, okay? But just because you can see improvement on the scale of 3 to 4 weeks doesn't automatically mean that because you're not seeing improvement on the scale of 3 to 4 weeks that, it's not working, right? So those are not two sides of the same coin. Again, that makes things a little bit more difficult to parse out. When we say that things aren't working, right, we basically have the problem of response, right? So if things aren't working, I think what you need to do is you need to say, well, what is it that I'm expecting to see benefit from? What is the change I made? Did you start using a foam roller once a day, right? Once a week, right? Well, guess what? Something like that doesn't do anything anyway, so you're not going to see any benefit from that. So I think that's the first thing, is to identify what is the nature of the intervention. Did you start, training twice a day instead of once a day? Did you add a longer session on the weekend? Did you add a all-out time trial workout once every 10 days? Okay, so identify what is the thing that you're doing, and then you want to ask yourself the question, well, what should I expect to get out of this, right? What would that indication that it's working look like? And again, the explanation for that can't be like, well, I feel better, okay, and it's easier for me to go faster, right? Which is, again, it's just this basic thing of like, well, this is working because it made it easier for me to do something better, right? And it happened very quickly. And the more quickly that benefit happens, the better it works. So what we want to see is we want to see an approach where we say, what is the specific nature of the change that I should expect to see here? What would make that change realizable or attainable? Is that going to be on the scale of one implementation? Is that going to be on the scale of, again, 8 to 10 weeks? I think if you introduce a longer run into your training schedule, if you introduce some longer rides, if you introduce, hey, on the weekends, I'm going to go out and I'm going to run for 90 minutes, and then I'm going to get on the bike and I'm going to ride the bike for 2.5 hours. I'm going to do that on Saturday and Sunday. Well, if you do that for one weekend, you're not going to see a discernible return from that. But if you do that for 10 weekends in a row, you're going to start to see a significant benefit. And I've seen this time and time again. A friend of mine that I've been, working out with a fair amount recently, they started doing some longer rides, and they had been recovering from some iron deficiency and had, take iron supplements, starting to get better, right? And so as the iron goes up, okay, now they can train more. They're more likely to absorb or get benefit from training. So they're starting from a level of not in the best shape they could be in because they had been limited or constrained by that condition for a while. So I'm acknowledging that it is when we're a little bit more detrained, we're going to see a little bit more pronounced benefit, right? But so they went from running like 8 or 9 miles at 10-minute pace, and that being a nightmare, to now running 22 miles at 9-minute pace very comfortably, right? But that happened over the scale of 3 months. Similarly, they went from doing a 50-mile ride being absolutely exhausting to then getting up to 120, 140-mile rides and feeling strong the whole way, and doing those 2 to 3 miles an hour faster than those other rides, maybe 30 to 40 watts, faster, higher normalized power average. Okay, but that's happening over the scale of 8 to 12 weeks. Okay, and with the running and the riding, that was something that a friend of mine and I, we had talked about was, as they're trying to, basically ask the question, is this working, right? Is this going to be effective? And I shared the perspective that, yeah, it's not going to feel like it at first, but all of a sudden you're going to go out there and you're going to start to notice, right, that things are measurably different, right? And that's the key thing. Are things measurably different, right? So struggling to run 10 miles or 9 miles at 10-minute pace to then running 22 miles at 9-minute pace over a hilly course versus this 9-mile run being over basically a pancake course, that is a significant measurable difference. There's multiple things in there that you can quantify, but it didn't happen between one run and the next, okay? The meaningful changes just take time. If we could improve our fitness in a tangible and fundamental physiological way, with immediacy, I think what we would find is that it's very easy for anybody to do training and get the results that they want. Okay. And we know that that is clearly not the case. Okay. So this idea of scale of improvement is also important, right? So reiterate, we need to say, what is the thing that I am doing differently? Number one. Number two, what do I expect that to look like on a scale of significance? And then number three, how long is that going to take to become physiologically evident? Okay. And then number four, how can I meaningfully assess whether or not that's been effective? Okay. Because there's so many things that can cause us to feel better or feel worse. Oftentimes you can have the fatigue bias, which is that the most immediate way you can create the optical illusion of something not working or working has to do with what our level of fatigue is from our training, okay? And this is a trap people fall into, is this idea that, well, you have to push your training to this absolute, failure boundary, and that's the point of proximal development and training. Now, the reality is that is far, far lower. But we are moving to this level of intensity because that's the echo chamber, right, is reinforcing us to do that. So as we continue to make and apply that approach, we're engendering a significant amount of fatigue. So if you start to then say, okay, well, I'm going to add this thing. I'm going to add this interval workout. I'm going to add this quantity of volume to my training. I'm going to add these kinds of longer sessions. I'm going to add this supplemental activity. I'm going to lift weights, whatever. Okay, well, anything you're doing is going to induce fatigue, okay? And usually if you introduce something new, most of us are tend to introduce that on top of it. We're tending to sort of add it into whatever our kind of concept of baseline activity is, right? So if we say, okay, I have a baseline activity of 14 hours a week, and then, okay, I'm going to do a longer run than I'm doing once a week. Or I'm going to start running 15 miles to 20 miles every weekend. I'm going to start doing a 5-hour ride at least once a week. Well, we don't usually approach that from the perspective of, okay, I guess I'm going to redistribute my training volume into these sessions. We just add that on top of our baseline, right? So we pick those 1 or 2 days and we either switch that day into intervals, or we take that day and we just stack that time in the extension of that. Right? So the reality is, even if we did redistribute that 14 hours into this different structure or pattern, we're still going to find that we're going to be fatigued. But now not only were you making these sessions more demanding, by the point at which they're terminated, but we're also just increasing the total time we're spending doing the activity. So there's multiple ways in which we're basically pushing up the fatigue. Therefore, when we go out and we look to determine, is it working? Of course, it's not going to be working in the way that we expect it to be, right? It's going to make things harder, right? And we're going to be going slower most of the time, right? You might have with long runs and long bike rides, right? So let's just focus on the long sessions, the over distance sort of super endurance oriented sessions as a COD example. Those are really fatiguing. And this has commonly been an area where people say, well, you don't want to do these long runs or these long rides because they're going to make you slow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's not true in aggregate, right? And it's very clear that doing longer runs on longer rides don't make you slow. But it's, when are you introducing it? What is the scale on which you expect to see that return? If you're a high school runner and you're doing your cross-country season and your track season or whatever, and you're like, you know what, I'm really feeling amped up, right? We've got these races happening now. I want to get better. I'm going to add in a 12-mile run once a week, but you usually only run 4 to 6 miles 5 days a week. There goes your whole season. Your season's gone. You have to introduce that 3 months before the start of the season. If you're trying to run, if you want to get the benefits of doing longer runs as a high school runner, then you would want to introduce that now, and then in the spring you would see that. And I had that experience, as I think about it now, my freshman year in college. At the end of cross country, I said I'm going to add in a 3-mile run every morning, which basically, adds another 20 miles a week. And then I also decided that I was going to do commit to doing this 12 to 13 mile run, right? Which in the scale of long runs isn't maybe anything remarkable, but in high school, we did a lot of 25 miles a week and we didn't really do long runs. So that was a significant change from what I had experienced doing. And I introduced that in November right into my routine. I went out and I ran 4:58 in the mile at the first track meet, an indoor track. The conclusion is this isn't working, right? But for whatever reason, at the time, I just kept doing it, right? Whether that was because of confidence that it was going to work or whether that was because of an unwillingness to accept the idea that I couldn't live out my conception of what it meant to be a runner and getting to train twice a day and doing this stuff. I don't really remember anymore. There probably really wasn't much thinking or self-evaluation going on. I just kind of kept doing it. And then by the time I got to March, things were then noticeably different, right? And when I get to the spring, run the 1500 and 4:15, right? So totally different dynamic of performance, right? At that point, things had changed, right? And that was on a scale of December, January, February, March into April, basically 4 or 5 months, right? So that's a big time scale, right? And if I had, at any point, especially in those first 3 to 3.5 months, at no point in there did it seem to be working, because at no point was it getting easier to go faster. If anything, I was going slower and it was harder to go slower. So is it, in that case, I suppose you could say patience is rewarded, but, training isn't just about being patient. It's about making good choices and having good reasoning. There was probably a better way to go about that. And then I wasn't able to ever recreate that, during that 4-year window of doing these activities as a college runner, right? So it's not as though I had, found the secret, right? But in that moment, right, of experience, something added up into something else. Okay? And long runs and long sessions, right, are just all fit under this same rule, that it takes a while to get benefit from anything that's going to really be beneficial. And that in the short term, anything that you think you see can create, there's all kinds of basically white noise and static that can obfuscate our ability to meaningfully reach a conclusion about whether or not our time has been well spent or whether or not our time is being wasted. And the fatigue, right, for me was a huge problem. I had a ton of fatigue all of the time. And I think that has had a sort of chronic influence on my thought process about doing this stuff, where I just accept a level of fatigue that probably is not right. And I just will go and I run and I feel like, an old wooden door when I start training a lot of the time. And that's not a product of being any particular age. It's always been like that. That sense of like, wow, like everything is heavy, the legs don't want to move, that's fatigue, and feeling like that every day. So if you start doing stuff and you're building and throwing in all this fatigue, and then you want to go out and try to do a lactate threshold test or some time trial or something that you think is a controlled measure of performance, you're not going to show results. And then you're going to conclude that it's not working. And this is one of the things that we see that generally holds people and coaches, so by people we mean athletes and the coaches of athletes, back from being willing to assign the kind of training that is going to make a substantive, meaningful difference over the long term. And it's the reason why people just kind of bail on this stuff. Because I think we're oftentimes looking for gumball machine wisdom in training, where we take something and it looks promising and exciting and we chew on it for 30 seconds and then it starts to lose its flavor. Or, right, we're like, well, this was the purple gumball, but there's also a green one and a red one and a yellow one and an orange one. And what about those flavors, right? The grass is always greener on the other side, right? We're in an environment in which people are saying these kinds of things. And one of the things that I have done recently is I've decided to step away from trying to coach people really at all, because trying to engage people in this process of like, let's approach training in this more reasoned way, right? You can present the evidence, you can make the arguments, you can show the data, you can explain what's going to happen. But I think that gumball wisdom tendency is in us as athletes, because I think we have this level of excitement and enthusiasm, and we're doing it because we want to feel like we're sort of making these metaphorical or maybe literal in some cases, but making these strides of progress where we're moving in a discernible way. We have a sense of immediacy in terms of, okay, what I'm doing is important and effective. And then when we go out to the first race or whatever and we don't see the dramatic, exciting result, okay, well, this must not be working. I'm just going to bail. And I think for me individually, it's not worth my time and energy to try to convince people that that's otherwise, because at that point you're engaging in debate and discussion, and the information is out there, right? We've talked about this stuff on this podcast ad nauseum, right? We communicate with people, and if that's not what people want to do, then, well, who cares? There's nothing wrong with that, right? At the end of the day, we should be engaging with this stuff in the way in which we think it's going to be most rewarding for us. Now, unfortunately, sometimes we know in practice that can lead to not actually getting the experiences that we want because we're injured, right? Or because we're overtraining, or because we're barking up the wrong tree, whatever form that may take, right? But that is just a reality of it. And I think as athletes, right, this is where we have to be self-aware that, like, we have the greatest agency in terms of the outcomes that we experience, because we have to make choices about what we're going to do. And I think one of the aggregate things that I have come to recognize more fully than I have ever perceived before is over the time that I've been recording and posting episodes in this podcast, is the extent to which, as people, right, we have a really hard time staying put with any given approach, because the perspective that we have in terms of evaluating, is this going to get me where I want to get, is very, very flawed, limited, if not non-existent. And engagement is equivalent to effectiveness in training. And we need to have a clear concept of how to confirm that we're making a worthwhile use of our time. And I think the second people start to feel like it's not working, right? So we want to see these numbers go up, basically, right? We want to see the power go up. We want to see ourselves producing the power number that we think is cool, right? We definitely don't want somebody to tell us, okay, well, we need to slow down. We want people to tell us that, okay, well, you need to go faster. We want to hear that we're faster, right? That's one of the fundamental barriers that we have in terms of thinking about this and problem solving the experience of training, is we want somebody to tell us that we're better than we are. We want to feel recognized. We want to be seen. And one of the ways that that's going to happen is by people assigning us training sessions and training intensities that's at the absolute boundary or maybe past the failure point of what we can do. Now, I'm not going to do that because it doesn't work. Okay? But as individuals, that's what we're seeing. We believe that's what everybody else is doing. We believe that's what's effective. That's what's coming out of the gumball machine, right? And we're chewing on that and we're getting amped up. Well, that's fine. You can go out and you can rip one session, but that's not training. Is that a session that you can do with good enough frequency to have whatever the effect is supposed to be over the scale of at least 8 weeks? The answer is no, right? Most of these sessions that people want to do are sessions that they can do one time, and then they have to have a full recovery of like 7 to 10 days of basically little to no training in order to get back to the point where they could actually do that session again. But people would rather just go out, take the session, do it the one time, that's awesome, that makes them feel amped, which is not training, that's just performing for yourself. It's just doing the workout as basically a race. And then they want to turn around and, okay, now I'm going to keep doing this session. But that's not a repeatable active training, right? So that doesn't work, okay? That's something that's not working, right? If we can't keep executing it, it's not working, okay? And so this brings us to the other form of not working. So if the first form of not working is figuring out, how do I recognize or understand if my training is causing the kinds of outcomes that I'm looking for, then the second kind of not working has to be, am I capable of taking what I'm doing and being honest about it? Is this something that I can repeat every single day? So if you want to get better, you need to have a consistent level of activity. In order to have a consistent level of activity, you need to have a level of intensity that is manageable so that you're not getting more and more and more exhausted. Because if you get more and more and more exhausted, you're either going to get injured, or if you're somebody who doesn't tend to get injured for whatever reasons, then you're just going to find yourself absolutely hitting the wall. So, as is always the case, this does leave us in a position where, there are not easy and clear solutions to what we're trying to do. Okay, but my core recommendation here is, number one, ask yourself this idea, where is it coming from in the first place? Right? Is this gumball wisdom, or is there something more substantive and strategic and validated in this thing that is influencing your approach and your thought process? Number two, you got to figure out how can you conclude that it's working? What observations can you look to make? What is the time scale on which you can perceive that? And then number three, the third thing is methodologically. You got to look at how you're training and say, okay, does it work for me to train like this? Can I actually sustain this over that, minimum, like say 8 to 10 week period that would usually be necessary to make a meaningful, demonstrable change in fitness? And can I manage the fatigue within that context that when I want to try to measure or track my progress, I can go out and actually see something? Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoy this, we have a variety of other past episodes you can check out for the podcast, and we'll also have an Instagram page at Black Cats Run. You can check that out as well. If you have questions or things you want to hear covered in other episodes, let us know, and we'll catch you next time.